Choosing the correct adaptive controller can be difficult, as there are a lot of different adaptive controllers on the market. This video is meant to help determine how to choose the correct adaptive controller based off of how somebody might have difficulty accessing a standard controller. Some individuals only have difficulty accessing some controls on a standard controller, so they can access most of a standard controller but might need help with just one or two buttons. Some individuals have difficulty accessing many controls, so they can partially access a standard controller, but they need a little bit more major adaptions to access the rest of the buttons they need to play. Some individuals have difficulty accessing most or all controls on a controller, so they can't really use any standard controller at all and need a completely different adaptive gaming setup. And then finally, there's one-handed gamers who can access a controller just using one side of their body. We're going to talk about different adaptions for each of these different situations. One option for individuals who have difficulty accessing most or all buttons on a standard controller is creating a customized gaming setup using the Xbox Adaptive Controller. The Xbox Adaptive Controller allows you to plug in adaptive switches into the switch ports on the side of the controller, and these large adaptive switches replace the buttons that are present on a standard controller. You can also plug in adaptive joysticks into the USB and switch ports on the controller, and these large adaptive joysticks replace the small joysticks that are present on a standard controller. You can then play video games using the large adaptive switches and adaptive joysticks that are plugged into the Xbox Adaptive Controller. The Xbox Adaptive Controller is a great option for those who need a really customized setup, as it allows you to pretty much orient the adaptive joysticks and switches in any way to meet an individual user's needs. However, one drawback of the Xbox Adaptive Controller is that it will be difficult to play games that require a lot of controls. Because if you're playing a game that requires 2 joysticks and 16 buttons to play, such as a first-person shooter game, it's going to be difficult to access all of those buttons and joysticks fast enough to completely play that game successfully. Therefore, it works best for games that require less controls. Here's a video of a racing game using the Xbox Adaptive Controller. The Xbox Adaptive Controller works great for racing games because they don't require a lot of controls to play and are pretty fun and fast-paced games. Here I'm using an adaptive joystick plugged into the Xbox Adaptive Controller, and I'm using the switches that are present on the face of the controller. But I can also plug in adaptive switches, if I so choose, into the side of the controller to replace the adaptive switches that are present on the face of the controller. The Hori Flex controller is another option that's very similar to the Xbox Adaptive Controller. It allows you to plug in adaptive switches that replace the buttons on a standard controller and adaptive joysticks that replace the joysticks on a standard controller. Then you can create a customized adaptive gaming setup using adaptive buttons and joysticks. Unlike the Xbox Adaptive Controller, the Hori Flex controller is directly compatible with the Nintendo Switch console. This type of controller works great for the Nintendo Switch because the Nintendo Switch has much simpler games to play that require less controls. So it works great for controllers like this, where the user is using large buttons and joysticks. Even if the user wants to game on the Nintendo Switch and wants to be able to use adaptive joysticks and switches, the Hori Flex still probably will not be the best option for the user. That's because the Hori Flex is more expensive and has less joystick compatibility than the Xbox Adaptive Controller. And the Xbox Adaptive Controller can actually be made to work with the Nintendo Switch console using something called an adapter. And since the Xbox Adaptive Controller is cheaper and has better compatibility, it's the preferred option even if the user wants to play on the Nintendo Switch console. The PlayStation Access controller is a little bit different than the Hori Flex and the Xbox Adaptive Controller. This controller is directly compatible with the PlayStation 5 console. The PlayStation Access controller has 9 buttons on the surface, 8 buttons on the outside and 1 in the middle, and these can be mapped to any button on a standard controller. It also has an attached joystick that comes off the side, and this can be remapped to either the left or the right joystick. The buttons on the controller on the outside can be switched out for different sizes and shapes based off of the individual user's needs, and the joystick can also be switched out for different sizes based off of what the individual can access easiest. If the user wants to use additional buttons or joysticks in addition to the ones present on the face of the controller, there's 4 switch ports in the side that allow the user to plug in 4 different options for adaptive joysticks or switches to add additional controls to their gaming setup. Because there's less options to plug in adaptive joysticks and switches, the user has less ability to customize this controller and has to rely more so on the ability that they can access the buttons and joysticks on the face of the device. Therefore, this controller design will be a little bit more limiting to some users unless they're able to access the buttons or joysticks on the face of the device. One nice feature about the PlayStation Access controller is that you can link 2 PlayStation Access controllers together and use them side by side to play a game. This works great for more complex games that require 2 joysticks and a lot of buttons to play, such as first-person shooter games, because this allows the user to access joysticks from both controllers and all 18 buttons from both controllers to be able to access all the buttons and joysticks they need to successfully play more complex games. When using a single PlayStation Access controller, it's going to work best for games that require a single joystick and less controls, such as racing games as shown in this video. Here I'm using a single access controller to play a racing game. If playing more complex games, it works best to link 2 access controllers together. This allows you to play using both joysticks from both controllers and all 18 buttons on both controllers. So it works great for games that are more complex, such as this one. The Quadstick controller is much different than the ones we've talked about previously. The Quadstick controller is a sip and puff video game controller that allows someone to play video games just using their mouth. It has 4 different components on it. It has a 3-hole mouthpiece, and the user can sip and blow into the 3 holes in different combinations for different controls in the game. It has a switch the user can hit with their lip for an additional control in the game. And it has a joystick that the user can move using lip and neck movements. Then it has a side tube that comes off the side of the Quadstick, and the user can sip and blow into this to switch between different gaming profiles that are optimized for the specific game that they're going to play. The Quadstick can be accessed very quickly compared to the other controllers, because it's as quick as the user can move their head side to side and sip and blow into the holes. So it has greater potential for the user to play at a faster pace. The Quadstick also allows you to program many more features into it compared to the other controllers that we talked about. So it allows you to really customize a specific gaming profile for a game. Because the Quadstick can be accessed much quicker, and you can program many more features into it, it has greater potential for the gamer to game at a higher pace and game more competitively compared to the other controllers that we talked about. When programmed correctly, the Quadstick allows you to play virtually any game just using your mouth. Because the controls can be accessed very quickly by simply moving your head side to side and sipping and blowing into the holes, the user can also play fairly fast-paced games. Another feature of the Quadstick is that it also allows you to plug in adaptive joysticks and adaptive switches, just like some of the other controllers that we talked about previously. Therefore, if the user wants to be able to access a joystick or an adaptive switch alongside the sip and puff on the Quadstick, they can do this to add additional controls to their setup. In this video, the user is using the Quadstick in addition to using a small adaptive switch that they're holding in their left hand. Every time they shoot in the game, you can see them squeezing the switch that's present in their left hand for an additional control in the game. In this video, the user is using an adaptive joystick that's plugged into the back of the Quadstick for player movement and also accessing an adaptive switch with their left hand. Therefore, the user can use the adaptive switch and the adaptive joystick alongside the sip and puff and joystick on the Quadstick to access even more controls when they're playing more complex games. For individuals who can partially access a standard controller, but have difficulty accessing many of the controls, they can use a feature called Copilot or Assist Controller. Copilot is a feature on Xbox that allows you to pair two controllers together and control the same user profile using both controllers. Therefore, the user can pair a standard controller with the Xbox adaptive controller, and for the controls they can't access on the standard controller, they can plug the adaptive joysticks and switches into the Xbox adaptive controller, then use both controllers side by side to access all the controls together to play the game they want to play. Assist controller is a similar feature that's available on PlayStation that also allows you to pair two controllers together to play a game. In this video, I'm using Copilot and paired a standard controller with the Xbox adaptive controller. And for the controls I have difficulty accessing on the standard controller, I have them plugged in as adaptive switches near the side of my standard controller. And I'm using both controllers together to access all the controls I need to play. One option for gamers who can only access a controller with one hand is the one-handed controller from Evil Controllers. For the right-handed gamer, they have a right-sided controller, in which there are two buttons added to the back of the right side of the controller and one to the front of the right side of the controller. And these replace some of the buttons that are present on the left side of the controller, allowing the user to access the buttons with their right hand. In addition, there's an external joystick that comes off the left side, and this can be mounted underneath the controller, underneath the user's right hand, underneath their elbow, or underneath another part of their body, allowing the user to access the left-sided joystick using the right side of their body. Therefore, they're able to access the buttons and joystick present on the left side of the controller just using the right side of their body. They also have versions for left-handed controllers as well, in which the configuration is reversed. One difficult thing when using this controller is that it is difficult to hold the controller and access all the buttons without the controller slipping out of the user's hands. So, it can be tricky sometimes to hold the controller when playing high-paced games. The user must keep this in mind if they are going to purchase this type of controller. Another option for one-handed gamers that may be easier to hold compared to the one-handed controller from Evil Controllers is the Azeron Cyro controller. The Azeron Cyro controller has a mouse pad on the bottom of the controller, and the user sets the device on a surface and can slide the device on the surface to control mouse movement, camera movement, or the right joystick in the game. Then it has a thumbstick the user can move, and this controls player movement or the left joystick in the game. Then there's buttons that the user can access with their fingers that are present on the side of the device, and these can be mapped to any button or keyboard control in the game. Therefore, the user can simply set the device on a surface and move the device around and access all the controls. Since it's set on a surface, it's slightly easier to hold compared to the one-handed controller from Evil Controllers. However, since it's a different way of accessing the controls compared to a standard controller, it does have a little bit more of a learning curve to get used to. Here's a video of the Azeron Cyro controller. The thumbstick is being used for player movement or the left joystick, and the device is being slid on a surface to control right stick movement or camera movement. Then the buttons are being accessed for the different controls in the game. One option that we talked about previously that also works for one-handed gamers is using Copilot or Assist controller. Using Copilot, as shown in this video, a user can link a standard controller with the Xbox adaptive controller and use both controllers together to access all the controls they need to play using just one hand. For the controls the user can't access on the opposite side of the controller, these controls are plugged in to the Xbox adaptive controller. For individuals who just need minor adaptations to their controller, one option is the lightweight controller from Evil Controllers. This controller removes the rumble motors inside the controller to make the controller overall more lightweight. So this is a good option for someone who fatigues easily and has difficulty holding the controller when gaming. The controller can also reduce the force needed to press in the buttons and triggers on the controller, as well as move the joysticks. So it's a good option for someone who can't generate enough force to move the joysticks or access the buttons on the controller. And then finally, buttons can also be added to the back of the device, and these can be mapped to any other button that's present on the face of the controller. Pro controllers, like the Victrix Pro BFG controller, are another good option for individuals who just need minor adaptations to their controller. The Victrix Pro BFG controller has grips on the side to help the user grip the controller. It also has buttons on the back that can be mapped to any button on the face of the controller. So if the user has difficulty, for example, accessing the trigger buttons on the top of the controller, these can be remapped to the back of the controller. You can also enable a feature called hairpin triggers, and this reduces the force needed to press in the triggers on the controller. Then finally, different pieces can be switched out to change the joystick orientation and shape, as well as the D-pad shape, to meet the individual user's needs. There are a lot of other simple adaptions that can be added to a controller to make minor modifications. Control Freak is a company that sells grips that can be added to the controller, and grips that can be added to the thumbsticks. C2 Grips is a company that sells large grips that can be added to the side of the controller. And then for individuals who need modifications to their thumbsticks, Thumb Soldiers is a company that sells a lot of different options for thumbsticks that can be added to the controller that have different shapes and sizes based off of an individual user's needs. Then finally, for users who need longer thumbsticks or thumbstick extenders, Evil Controllers sells different sizes of thumbstick extenders that can be added to the controller.